Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Gendering Geopolitics, where I have quick 10-minute conversations with women doing amazing work around the world. My name is Emily Prey, and I'm a senior analyst at the New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. Today, I have the privilege of speaking to Shaharzad Akbar, the chairperson of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. Thank you so much for being here, Shaharzad.
Thank you for having me, Emily.
So today we're obviously going to be discussing Afghanistan. Over 75% of the Afghan government's budget comes from international donors, and Human Rights Watch recently reported that cuts in donor funding have already damaged women's access to healthcare and girls' access to education. So moving forward, whether it's the Afghan government or the Taliban or some form of both in power, how can donors navigate and respond to abuses by those in power without harming women and girls by cutting essential services and cutting off funding?
So donor conditionality is one of the issues that the international community brings up when there are concerns raised about a future government where women's rights or the rights of minorities will be curtailed severely. But while conditionality is necessary, also on issues like anti-corruption, it's very important to design the conditionality in a way that doesn't harm the most vulnerable, the women, children, displaced communities, people who need essential services. Delivery of essential services like education and health should not be compromised because donors or international community is not happy with the performance or policies of the government. It's not easy, but it is doable. There is also a big non-governmental sector in Afghanistan that has been doing service delivery for a long time. Because of the reality of war, many areas that are not reachable for government institutions, these non-governmental organizations partner with government to deliver services. That's one aspect of it. But also generally, in terms of conditionality, the thinking around conditionality should be done in a way that doesn't jeopardize health and safety and well-being of the Afghan people over disagreements with the Afghan government.
So over the last several years, and particularly during the Trump administration, the U.S. did not stand up for women's rights around the world or in Afghanistan. Even though the U.S. invoked the rights of plight of Afghan women to justify the invasion and the war, when I spoke to the wonderful Jane Ferguson from PBS NewsHour last month, she said that in terms of American policy, people had stopped talking about women's rights years ago. But now that the US is withdrawing, everyone and their mother wants to know what will happen to Afghan women. Bearing in mind that Afghan women obviously have agency and have fought very hard for their rights and access to opportunities, what are some of the ways that they're preparing themselves for the September 11th withdrawal?
So Afghan women are not a homogeneous group. I think this is one of the misconceptions. Of course, there are differences and differences of lived experiences because of the reality of conflict, but differences in expectations. But I think one unifying theme is that Afghan women do want more opportunities and more protection from violence, more and better services, more rights. Now, these more rights might mean different things for different women. For a woman in a village who has been suffering the conflict, the first thing that she may want more than anything is, a ceasefire and an end to conflict. And so her perspective on withdrawal or how she's preparing might differ from someone else who really wants to be, Supreme Court judge and really thinks that this ambition is now impossible because Taliban might return to power. So that's the first issue. The second is that Afghan women and Afghan women's movement has been working both at the national and the local level to push for ceasefire, to push for peace, and also to prepare to have a meaningful role in the peace process so that their voices can be heard and so that they can reason. The question now is, first, will there be a meaningful peace process? Will Taliban truly negotiate? Do they have the will to negotiate? And second, if there is meaningful will from that side, from both sides, in fact, for negotiations, what will the space look like for women? Will there be enough space for women to be represented? So far, it has not been satisfactory at all, as you know. So the push is continuing from the Afghan women's movement for ceasefire, for talks, and for meaningful talks with meaningful inclusion of women.
I want to thank you for bringing up the point that Afghan women are not all the same. I think that's something that's really important that is being missed by a lot of the media surrounding the withdrawal right now. So I want to talk about Bachabazi. And for those who are watching, Bachabazi is the practice of boys dressing up as girls to dance in front of men. But in recent decades, it has essentially become an avenue for wealthy or powerful men to rape and sexually abuse young boys. The world is incredibly focused on Afghan girls, but don't quite realize the vulnerability of Afghan boys or how Bachabazi is actually linked to the rise of the Taliban, since it's been said that one of the reasons, the main reasons that the Taliban rose to power in the 90s was their stance against Bachabazi. So in the last 20 years, the practice has actually greatly increased because many of the perpetrators are in power. They're government officials, they're police officers, and other wealthy and powerful men. With the US leaving and the government losing that important presence and support of troops, what does this mean for those boys?
Bachabazi is one of the biggest ills in our society, and it's something that all sides are implicated in. So there is, unfortunately, related to conflict where there is recruitment of child soldiers or child fighters, which Taliban also do, then there is high vulnerability to sexual abuse and more prevalence of Bachabazi. While in the formal structure of the security forces, we have seen a reduction, considerable reduction in recruitment of child soldiers. It's important to remember that there are, semi-formal forces, local militias, etc., supported directly or indirectly by the government that are still involved in these practices. There are cases and also allegations about both formal forces, but less so and more about the informal forces. And of course, we don't have enough insight into Taliban-controlled areas, but there are always rumors and allegations about Bachabazi in those areas as well. I think this will remain a main fight for human rights defenders and human rights activists in Afghanistan, but it's also important to remember that there were also reports of international forces looking away, people in the international community looking away when their allies in the war and terror were engaged in these practices, local allies. So I think as we move forward, this issue needs to remain at the center of attention as well, because boys, children do remain vulnerable. And as conflict and violence in local militias increase, there's increased vulnerability.
So 48% of the population in Afghanistan is under the age of 15, and 68% is under the age of 25. So the majority of Afghans have never known Taliban rule. What does this mean for them moving forward?
There is obviously a lot of anxiety from many different segments in the Afghan population. I think for the young people, it's very frustrating to watch because there aren't a lot of platforms that really amplify the voices and demands of youth and really meaningfully engage youth. There is a sense that young people are only being recruited in a systematic way for war, but that they are not being involved enough in decisions around peace. And their potential and their capacity is not being utilized to make peace and build peace and move forward. It's very ironic that in a country that's majority youth, key decisions about our future are made by a few old men. So I think it's important to remember this big constituency and try to continuously provide platforms for them, for the Afghan youth, and to also remember that they have very different expectations and aspirations, even if they haven't had a lot of opportunities because of the conflict. They do want to live like kids in the neighboring countries and across the world. They want to have access to education, to employment, have healthy families, all aspirations that we all have everywhere. And these aspirations can be a real force for good if it's tapped into in a meaningful way.
And what is the role of institutions like the one that you're leading, the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, what can their role be in influencing peace processes?
The Commission is partial to human rights and impartial in the conflict. We are trying and working very hard as an independent institution to document all atrocities, to continue to push for justice and accountability, including with the latest horrific attack on the girls' school in Kabul, continuously calling for ceasefire, continuously pushing both sides to talk and offering mechanisms for making the process more inclusive. For instance, how to bring victims' voices to the process, how to design victims' testimonials that will wake both sides up to the urgency of ending this war, but also create discussions around justice and accountability in the operations, and also push for greater and meaningful inclusion of women and minorities and other groups that feel isolated.
And last question, just before we end. Civilian deaths have spiked recently, with women and girls being the primary targets. There was the devastating attack on the school in Kabul that you just mentioned, where girls were specifically targeted, and no group has taken responsibility for the attack yet. What does it feel like to be an Afghan woman right now?
There's a lot of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty. Afghan women are worried about their future in case the violence increases even more, because women are more vulnerable to an all-out war. But also, there are concerns, obviously, about the political process and what the outcome of that political process will be, to what extent women's voices will be heard. But women professionals across Afghanistan, with the rise in targeted killings, are genuinely also worried about survival, about surviving this yet another bloody period, which we don't know if it's a few weeks, if it's a few months. Will it get better? Will it get worse? So that's on a lot of people's minds.
Shaharzad Akbar from the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, thank you so much for joining me today. This was such a wonderful conversation. I learned a lot. I'm sure that our audience learned a lot as well. Thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Emily. Great speaking to you, and thank you for bringing attention to this. I appreciate it.